Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Global Connections Television is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a computer, you have a website, and you like our shows, and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're going to be talking about national security issues, and my guest is an expert on almost all of them, if not all of them. My guest today is Dr. Robert Farley. Dr. Robert Farley is a senior lecturer at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. Dr. Farley, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
I appreciate you being back. We did this several years ago.
Quite a while now, quite a while.
Yeah, right after you'd written a book that we'll talk about in just a few minutes. But let's talk about, I didn't go into this in the opening, but I'll just mention that you're expert in many areas, and three thematic areas are military doctrine, transnational politics, and national security. Is there an example of each that you could use to kind of shed a little more light on what each one means?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's one great example that really ties all three of them in. We talk a lot right now about the challenges that are emerging with the development of China into a world power. And a lot of those challenges, they have to do with military doctrine, so how the military is thinking about what might be a conflict with the Chinese in the future. They involve technology and technology policy with China, so whether the technology policy that we're pursuing gives us the best technology, but also how we think about technology transfers to China, how we think about China appropriating intellectual property from us. And that all has a tremendous amount to do with national security, right? So all three of those really are wrapped together in the way that people are behaving towards and with China, and the people they are behaving towards us.
Do you have any suggestions? This is a very thorny issue, obviously, but how do we improve our relations with China right now? We're in sort of a trade war with China and applying tariffs, that type of thing. Are there a couple of helpful hints on what we should do or could do to ratchet down some of the rhetoric, but also to improve our working relationship, because they are one of our key partners, especially in the trade area?
I mean, honestly, I think that whatever policy we decide on, and there are arguments for a more restrictive trade regime with China, I don't tend to support them, but there are good arguments for them. But we need to become more concrete and predictable with the way that we're dealing with the Chinese, right? Right now, I think that we've had a set of policies that feel like they're cooked up just in a few moments, rather than well considered and being strategic over a long period of time. And so I think really, whatever we decide to do, we just need to decide it and build a long-term strategy around that, rather than jumping from crisis to crisis with the Chinese.
Right, and it does seem rather transactional, I would say, as far as just policies that are not well thought out, policies that are just, they change from day to day almost, and you can't run a government like that, and you cannot be successful in the long run. So it's a very interesting approach.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think that there are good arguments, for example, for restricting Huawei, but we've changed our policy on Huawei so many times now that the Chinese don't know what they have to do to get back into our good graces, right? And that's a very dangerous situation.
And Huawei is?
Huawei is a large technology firm in China that has close ties with the Chinese Communist Party, close ties with the People's Liberation Army, and that we worry a lot about being foundational to sort of global internet networks. And those concerns are well founded, but we've attempted to sanction them in very clumsy and scattershot ways that sort of make the Chinese angry without actually doing anything about the problem.
And for the past several years, you've been a lecturer at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce, and the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, Kentucky is one of about 40 foreign service schools around the United States, or maybe more than that, I'm not sure. But if our viewers are interested, they can go to www.uky.edu/Patterson School and get more information on a very great institution.
All right, absolutely. If any of the viewers are interested in further education, in foreign policy, in diplomacy, for themselves, for their kids, then I would recommend going to the website and checking us out.
Now, this past year, you were a visiting scholar, I guess it was, at the War College. Is that correct? The Army War College? Or
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about that, and how did that develop, and what were you doing there?
Well, so yeah, the visiting professor in the Department of National Security Strategy at the United States Army War College, which is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And what I was doing there was being part of a teaching team for a group of students, almost all of whom were lieutenant colonels and colonels, or the equivalent, for essentially moving to the strategic stage of their career, right? So having dealt with a certain level of things with tactics and with operations, then moving up to thinking about strategy. That's sort of the writ of the Army War College. And it was an immensely rewarding experience. There are lots of international students there and students from all of the different services in the United States. And it was the first time I've got to teach students my own age in quite a while. So they got all of my pop culture references. We were all the same age, and so that was a lot of fun.
It.
Yeah,
that's very important. Very important. Well, I'm sure you discussed a lot of major issues, and one I'm sure you discussed, probably talk about strategic operations and strategic outreach, is the Space Force. We've heard the Trump administration came up with this idea several months ago. First off, what is it? What do they conceive the Space Force to be? I've not heard very much information on it. It's just the idea is out there floating around. And how did you folks at the War College discuss this?
Well, Space Force ideas have been around for a while, so I think that the first serious floating of the idea of a Space Force came during the 2000s, and then has recurred every now and again as people have thought about, are we falling behind in space, or are there problems in space? President Trump reinvigorated conversation about the Space Force in 2018 when he made it a plank in his speeches and sort of talking a lot about it, and this got everyone else talking about it. The idea behind a Space Force, as formulated by President Trump, is that we need another separate service in the uniformed service in the United States military. So the Space Force would be independent in the same way that the Air Force is, the Navy, and the Army, and would have its own recruiting, would have its own responsibilities, and would be dedicated to thinking about and fighting war in space.
Did you come to a conclusion? Well, first off, if we do this, are we talking about weaponizing space, which is banned by many treaties, as I understand it? We had the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. The last thing, we've not done a very good job controlling nuclear weapons on planet Earth. Are we planning to move these into outer space? This could even be more dangerous than the situation we have today.
Well, creating a Space Force essentially just means that you have a dedicated set of professionals and a dedicated set of doctrines for thinking about how you use the space in a military way. And so the ways we use the space for military purposes right now are mainly communications, reconnaissance, connectivity, those kinds of things, right? So they let military personnel know where they are, know where the enemy is, keep in contact with one another. And most of the proposals for a Space Force have focused on those kinds of missions. There is some thinking about, and this is sort of far in the distance thinking, about what offensive space warfare might look like, right? So not just protecting our space assets, but potentially harming or disrupting an enemy's space assets. That in the end may lead down a road where we think about the weaponization of space, where we think about, God forbid, nuclear weapons in space, something along those lines. But you can have a Space Force without crossing those into that area, right? It can be dedicated to a specific set of things that are related to what we do right now.
Exactly. As you mentioned, reconnaissance, communication, logistical support, things such as that, but without weaponizing it.
Right. Absolutely.
Well, this sort of ties into the book that you wrote. The last time you were on the show, we talked about the Air Force. And I believe your argument at the time was, or your thesis was, that the United States Air Force is really a duplication because all the other major branches, the Army, Navy, the Marine Corps, who did I leave out? I guess that's it. They all
Coast Guard.
Coast Guard. The Coast Guard has their own aircraft also.
They do.
They do. Yeah. So tie that into your book. And is the U.S. Air Force, could it be consolidated into these other branches of the service, or how would that interface?
Well, there's a bit of an irony about it because were we to create a Space Force, it would primarily take away assets from the current United States Air Force. Most of the assets and the personnel who would be Space Force are currently have a home in the Air Force. But I think that the arguments that run against an independent Air Force, and you're right, I mean, I think that we shouldn't have one, it should be part of the other services, are even stronger for a Space Force, right? Almost everything that the Space Force does is something that it does for another service, whether it's GPS or communications reconnaissance. And so focusing on those capabilities basically makes it a service organization to the other services. If we create a Space Force in the same way that we created an Air Force in 1947, we run the risk of creating what amounts to a parochial, self-interested organization that focuses on its own priorities, its own doctrine, and its own acquisition of resources at potentially the expense of its services to the other services. And so that's a significant problem. We've already seen that problem in the United States and elsewhere with the creation of independent air forces. It just gets worse with the Space Force.
And there would be a duplication of effort. There's no doubt about it.
Right.
Overlapping programs, that type of thing. And that brings us to the U.S. Department of Defense. Everybody wants us to have a strong Defense Department. I have not talked, well, I'm sure there's some people out there who may not, but I haven't spoken with them, let's put it like that. But that brings to mind the whole situation with the Department of Defense. We've heard for the last couple of years that we've had this hollowing out of the military. The military people with whom I've spoken and the foreign policy experts say really that's not the case, that the Defense Department has had way more money than it needs. In fact, the U.S. Government Accountability Office, which is a bipartisan legislative oversight office, as you're aware, has said for years that 20 cents on the dollar in the Defense Department is wasted, waste, fraud, and abuse. My question is, now this year we have, I think it's about $730 billion budget for the Defense Department. What recommendations could we make to the Defense Department to make it more accountable, to make it more efficient, more effective, and to not waste as much money? Because we're talking 20 cents on the dollar of that's 1.5 billion. No,
it's a lot of money.
$150 billion.
Right,
So I'm
right,
sorry,
right,
not 1.5. It's a lot of money, right?
It's a lot of money. And,
you
and
got it.
The estimates on that point differ a lot, but I think that the focus on things like fraud and waste is a little bit misplaced. One of the reasons I think you have so much waste in the Defense Department is because we have constructed so many layers of accountability, right, which are all very sensible and which all sort of make Congress people happy and so forth. But a very wise person once said to me, you can waste as much money as you want as long as you are saying that you are tracking down the waste of money. Right? There is no limit to the amount of money you can waste trying to prevent people from wasting money. And this is true whether you're talking about welfare reform or you're talking about the Pentagon. The big problems with the Pentagon and the Department of Defense in terms of how much money we spend can't be solved by different accounting procedures to manage fraud or to manage waste. They can be solved by deciding we want the military to do less things and then spending less money, right? If we need a smaller Navy, we need to decide that we need a smaller Navy or a smaller Air Force, or we need the Army to do fewer things. I think the frustration, and this comes from a lot of the professionals at the Army War College, people understand that we spend so much money on defense and that that amount of money may be excessive to what we actually need. The frustration there is that, well, we know we're spending too much money, but you're asking us to do too many things, right? You're asking us to be in too many parts of the world at one time, to do too many different things, to have the most advanced technology 3 or 4 times, 3 generations ahead of what other people do. As long as you're asking us to do this, we'll do our best, but we don't have enough money, right? So you have to change what you're asking us to do, then you can reduce the amount of money that we're spending on the Pentagon.
Right, exactly. What we, as of now, I think we have about 950 overseas bases, is that correct? Something like that? Or 900, it's up in that area.
There are a lot of definitional issues about what constitutes a base.
A base, right. Some are very large, some are very small.
Right. And I don't know the exact number, but it varies a lot depending on what the criteria you use are.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of the military experts have argued for years that we may have too many military bases in the United States. But then you try to close them,
Right.
and it becomes a political issue, and no member of Congress wants a base closed in his or her congressional district. It just doesn't play well, and so
Right.
that is going to be a long, ongoing challenge, I think.
Right.
We were talking about the Defense Department also. The Defense Department has done some excellent studies, and they look ahead. They look over the horizon, see what are some of the issues, problems, challenges they're going to meet as they move forward. And one that is resonating, it has been for years and years, has been on climate change. Now, the Trump administration has a totally different opinion than the military people, as I understand it, is climate change. Why does the Department of Defense think climate change, which now we're saying climate change crisis, is such a major challenge?
The Department of Defense takes climate change very, very seriously for just a bunch of reasons. And the reasons are different between the different services. The most concerned is probably the Navy, because the Navy sees two things happening. It sees populations around the world becoming more vulnerable to climate disasters, which means that the Navy has to do more things, right? And in some cases, it just literally means there's more water to cover. And so you need more boats to do that, or you need boats that do different things. The second reason the Navy is really taking this seriously is because its biggest bases are under dire threat from rising sea levels. And so one of the big things that people think about at Norfolk is, my goodness, what happens if we get another major hurricane, or what happens if sea levels rise a few more inches? It has the potential to devastate the infrastructure there in ways that are going to be incredibly expensive, and they're going to take away from the budget for the rest of the service. Navy also thinks about the Arctic a lot as ice there melts and seaways open up. Army thinks about a lot of the same problems. Air Force thinks about a lot of the same problems. And all of the services are thinking about how do we mitigate the damage to us from what is happening with the climate right now. Because they know, right? I mean, you have bases in Alaska that don't look anything like they looked 30 years ago, right? With soil and ground that doesn't work in the same way as it worked 30 years ago. And so you can't hide any of that, and you can't deny any of that to the people who are using this terrain on a daily basis.
And it seems that every time we pick up the paper, there's another study. There are more photos of sled dogs in Alaska running not over ice and snow, but over slush. It's melting. We saw the heat wave in Europe this past summer, moved into Greenland, melted a glacier away. And they're predicting now within 30 years there will be no ice in the Arctic. And that is not that's a very sobering situation, especially if you have methane coming out of the ocean and that type of thing. And some of them are even predicting by 2100 there'll be no ice on the planet. So these are major challenges, and in many cases the military will have to deal with these. They have to confront them, because you have climate change refugees, people who are on the move. You have wars that will start between countries.
Right.
Water is running out. We see that right now. That's happening today. So these are major challenges.
Oh, absolutely. And it affects something down to how many icebreakers we build. Right. Weirdly enough, climate change in the Arctic means we need more icebreakers, because people use the Arctic more, and means that we need more icebreakers to actually get ships up there to have any kind of impact on what's going on.
If we wait long enough, we won't need any icebreakers. The game will be over.
Well, again, God forbid, but
Well, yeah, we're moving, unfortunately. Right. Yeah, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change just came out with their 6th report a few months ago now, I guess, and said we have about 12 years to get a handle on climate change, or it will get a handle on us, and we will not be able to reverse it. And we're seeing it right now. It is actually happening. Well, that's a major problem we're going to have to be dealing with. Let's talk about a few other areas. Did you have a chance to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian issue when you were at the War College?
Strangely enough, we did not talk extensively about a lot of sort of specific areas like that, especially areas where the United States wasn't directly involved. And so Israel-Palestine would be one of those. My feeling on Israel-Palestine is that there are a set of intractable problems there, and that the balance of power and the balance of capabilities has been moving in the direction of the Israelis decisively over the past decade. And we see that reflected in the behavior of the Israeli Prime Minister, who is less and less in the mood for any sort of cooperation, any sort of compromise with the Palestinians. But we also see that in the behavior of the Gulf countries, so Saudi Arabia and the others, who are hedging their bets with respect to the Palestinians, who see sort of a strong benefits to potential cooperation with Israel that they haven't seen for a long time. And so, without sort of making any recommendations about how to resolve the issue or the direction it might go, I think things look bleaker now for the Palestinians than they have looked in a very long time.
Yeah, and when the United Nations created Israel and Palestine back in 1947-48, they created it with the idea of a two-state solution, and that's been in the UN resolutions. That's been really the policy of almost every country in the world, to have a two-state solution. But now Prime Minister Netanyahu is moving towards a one-state solution, which means absorbing the Palestinians into Israel. Can that be done without creating an apartheid state? Because if you bring them in, you're either going to have to give them the vote or do the way South Africa did, not let the blacks vote, not let the Palestinians vote. So how do you see that unfolding?
As I understand it, the Israelis have a variety of different ways in which they can confine Palestinians to particular territorial areas and yet not grant the franchise in any kind of meaningful way. And that increasingly is being framed as something like a one-state solution where, essentially you have a degree of Palestinian self-government without any kind of trappings of an international state, but where Palestinians do not have, other than Palestinians who live directly in Israel, Palestinians don't have any kind of power over what happens in international policy or anything along those lines. One
other issue that's weighed on my mind, and a lot of other foreign policy experts, I'm not a foreign policy expert, but people with whom I speak, is the decline of American leadership. And we've seen it dramatically over the last 2 years. It has plummeted in many areas. In fact, the only two countries, the latest Pew International opinion poll that was taken, public opinion poll, shows that in Israel and Russia is the United States more popular. And every other country is just down, some countries single digits or low double digits. Did you folks discuss that very much, about the abdication of leadership, how we've not been a strong advocate for civil rights, for human rights around the world, where you mentioned that we're developing policies from day to day, minute to minute, hour to hour, that are really not very well thought out, that are just shot off the top of the head and that type of thing. It's sort of a knee-jerk reaction to a problem. But did that enter into your discussions at the War College?
It certainly did, and it's a two-edged sword, because we can talk about American leadership and the importance of American leadership, and most of the people at the War College take that idea very seriously. Most of the people at the Patterson School take that idea very seriously as well. I mean, these are all foreign policy professionals, whether it's a colonel in the Army or someone who's part of the State Department or someone who's part of the Central Intelligence Agency. All of those people sort of take foreign policy seriously and take American leadership seriously. I think there is concern at the War College and elsewhere that we are asking, by taking on a leadership role, we run the risk of asking too much of ourselves, right? Of asking too much of our professionals, of demanding too much for the United States, and taking too much of a role in international affairs. And so a way that this would happen is we would think about sort of taking a leadership role in a human rights crisis somewhere and then ending that human rights crisis, which then down the road sort of incidentally involves us in a military confrontation that we don't want to be involved in. So say, for example, what's going on in Hong Kong right now. On the one hand, the United States ought to be supportive of the Hong Kong protesters and the pursuit of their democratic rights. On the other hand, we have to be extremely careful about the ways that our support is interpreted in Hong Kong and is interpreted in China, because we certainly don't want to be part of any kind of militarized confrontation with the Chinese over Hong Kong. We don't want people in Hong Kong to take unnecessary risks under the belief that we might become part of some sort of confrontation.
Right, that would be the last thing we want to do, is get into a war over Hong Kong, that's for sure. No, it's very true. I guess the question arises, though, when we look at this situation, that we have to determine exactly how much of a leadership role we want to play. Do we want to be consistent as to what previous administrations have done as far as promoting human rights? Can we be viewed as a reliable partner in the future? And most of our NATO allies today don't view America as a reliable partner, a responsible partner. In fact, most of the polls show, even though she's on the way out the door, Angela Merkel is considered as the leader of the free world today. So these are all issues that we're going to be wrestling with. And Dr. Rob Farley, I really appreciate you coming and bringing us up to date on these very interesting and very important issues that we'll be discussing today, tomorrow, and for many, many years. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
All right, well, thank you. It's been a delight to be here.
Thank you. My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.